They assumed they were dealing with a navy that just shows the flag and complains afterward. Instead, they ran into a destroyer that communicates through plotted courses, speed changes, and cold, precise closest point of approach calculations. In November 2025, a massive 70,000-ton Russian tanker called Seahorse quietly departed Matanzas, Cuba. It had just unloaded a shipment of Russian naphtha, a light petroleum product commonly used to thin Venezuela's extra-heavy crude, and then turned south. On the surface, it looked like a routine commercial run. But beneath that paperwork was a very different reality. The tanker appeared on nearly every Atlantic sanctions radar. It had cycled through multiple names, flown different flags, and earned a reputation as part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet vessels, designed to keep sanctioned oil and fuel moving when international law says they shouldn't. Venezuela was the end goal. But standing between the Seahorse and that destination was the USS Stockdale, an Arleigh Burke class destroyer with a straightforward assignment: make the journey as dangerous and uncomfortable as possible without ever pulling the trigger. To understand why a single tanker drew this level of attention, you have to zoom out. For years, Washington has been trying to cut off the hard currency propping up Nicolas Maduro's government. That campaign included sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, pressure on international buyers, and a quiet maritime chess match aimed at the networks delivering fuel and diluents into the country. Russia, Iran, and their partners answered that pressure with a workaround: an invisible armada of shadow ships, operating in the gray space between legality and enforcement. Veteran ships with murky ownership trails, spotty upkeep, and a talent for taking suspicious routes began moving naphtha and crude through the legal gray areas of global shipping. What made this web so difficult to crack was the range of countries willing to play along. Iran had already perfected its own sanctions-proof model, a fleet of tankers, running on inconsistent AIS signals, layered shell companies, and precisely coordinated ship-to-ship meetups far from prying eyes. Once tougher sanctions hit Moscow, many of those same tactics quietly found their way into Russia's playbook. Some vessels all but vanished, sliding through narrow sea lanes with signals that blinked on and off, or filing misleading port records that left regulators chasing shadows. China became part of the equation as well, though in a more indirect way. Smaller Chinese traders and independent refineries were often happy to snap up heavily discounted oil, asking few questions, as long as the documents attached to the cargo provided just enough separation from its true origin. Together, these actors formed a loosely connected network of tankers operating well outside the standards most legitimate shipping companies follow. None of this was accidental or improvised. Every country involved had its own strategic logic, and each loophole they exploited further weakened Washington's ability to squeeze Venezuela using conventional pressure alone. That's why one tanker, the Seahorse, stood out. It had gone through multiple identities, sailed under different flags, landed on EU and UK sanctions lists, and had already been flagged by independent monitors for its role in Iran-Venezuela trade. To AIS trackers, it appeared to be nothing more than an aging 21-year-old tanker. But on a U.S. targeting brief, it represented influence and opportunity. And one more variable was about to shape what came next. The USS Stockdale wasn't in the Caribbean by chance. The destroyer was operating under U.S. Southern Command as part of an expanded counter-narcotics mission, a deployment that also gave Washington a convenient way to lean on sanction dodging, shipping in areas normally handled by smaller cutters and patrol boats. An Arleigh Burke class warship, packed with Aegis radar, embarked helicopters, and advanced communications, is excessive for chasing drug smugglers. But it's exactly the right tool for quietly signaling a tanker like the Seahorse. After clearing Cuban waters and settling into a southbound track toward Venezuela, the tanker seemed to be making a normal run somewhere along that route. However, the U.S. destroyer positioned itself and began shaping how the encounter would unfold. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. There were no dramatic standoffs or aggressive maneuvers, just two vessels transiting a crowded stretch of sea. But the digital picture told another story. AIS data, satellite imagery, and radar showed the Seahorse pushing south as Stockdale. Adjusted onto a crossing course. Two independent tracks slowly converged into something intentional. As the tanker neared the outer edge of Venezuelan waters, its heading abruptly changed. Instead of pressing on, the ship made a wide turn and swung back north, then northwest. It didn't stop. It didn't attempt to reach the oil terminal. The only clear change in the environment was the destroyer's track, now sitting squarely along the tanker's projected route. This is how pressure is applied at sea. A warship like Stockdale doesn't need to crowd or threaten another vessel to make its point, simply holding position in the other ship's path, visible on sensors, and to the naked eye, sends a message loud and clear. If bridge-to-bridge communications happen, they remain calm and formal. Call signs are exchanged, identities verified, and there's an unspoken reminder that this voyage is being watched by the United States, for the Russian captain, and for whoever is really calling the shots behind the scenes. That message carries weight. A tanker under sanctions is already toxic as far as insurers are concerned. Add a U.S. destroyer paying close attention, and the risk level spikes even higher. Faced with that reality, the Seahorse backed off. A few days later, it made another run. Its AIS signal showed the ship easing south again, passing north of Aruba and lining up for another approach toward the Venezuelan coast. The Stockdale was still in the area. Once more, the destroyer adjusted its course to sit ahead of the tanker. And once again, the Seahorse slowed its advance, altered course, and withdrew. Before the week ended, the tanker tried a third time to reach Venezuela, and for the third time, the AIS data told an identical story. Advance. Turn away. Retreat. By then, analysts watching the situation were already describing it as a game of cat and mouse, even a form of shadow blockade. On tracking screens, it appeared that a single U.S. destroyer had effectively kept a sanctioned Russian tanker out of Venezuelan ports without ever touching it. Every aborted attempt also sharpened the intelligence picture. Analysts could line up the Seahorse's movements with those of other sanctioned vessels, cross-reference timing and locations with port visits, and spot patterns in ownership, flags, and operators that kept reappearing. That way, when a similar tanker shows up off West Africa, in the eastern Mediterranean, or near another sanctions pressure point, the response is already mapped out. Allies are paying attention. Regional partners in the Caribbean and Latin America watch these tracks closely, and European regulators do the same. When they see a U.S. destroyer applying pressure through presence, maneuvering, and meticulous documentation, instead of force, it creates a precedent they can point to later. It also sends a clear signal. Washington is willing to put real military capability in front of sanctions enforcement, not just leave it to accountants and compliance officers. And this is where international law ultimately draws the boundary lines. Under international law, a blockade is considered an act of war. It requires formal declarations, defined rules, and typically a coalition prepared to enforce it against multiple vessels. None of those conditions existed here. The Stockdale stayed entirely in international waters, and there's no public evidence of warning shots, boardings, or forced stops. U.S. Southern Command hasn't released its specific rules of engagement, but specialists agree this operation was nowhere near a traditional blockade. So what do you call it? Pressure applied through smart positioning instead of raw force. That's strategy. A destroyer like Stockdale offers far more than an intimidating silhouette. Its helicopters can range far beyond the ship, visually confirm a tanker's identity, photograph hull numbers and markings, and spot inconsistencies in AIS transmissions. Inside the Combat Information Center, crews merge commercial ship tracking data with classified sources and intelligence from partners. The result is a detailed map, not just of one tanker, but of the broader network it belongs to. Physically stopping the Seahorse would have opened a legal minefield. The vessel was sanctioned by the EU and the UK, but not by the US Treasury. There's no UN ban on Russian fuel shipments to Venezuela, interfering with it directly in international waters. Absent weapons use or an immediate self-defense justification would have handed Moscow and Caracas a propaganda victory and exposed Washington to claims of violating freedom of navigation. Intimidation without interception is different. By forcing the tanker to reverse course again and again, the destroyer stretched the voyage, drove up costs, and dragged the operation into the spotlight. Every aborted approach burned extra fuel, caused delays, and left behind a clean AIS trail that analysts could dissect in detail. Each attempt also exposed more than just the tanker's route. Analysts could see which vessels altered course near it, which lingered in the vicinity, and whether smaller ships appeared to trail its movement. From an operational standpoint, Seahorse became more valuable for what it revealed than for where it was trying to go. Every time the captain turned south and found a gray warship waiting, someone in Moscow, Caracas, or an insurance office likely picked up the phone. Those conversations never make headlines, but their effects showed up clearly on the chart. Indecision, looping tracks, and days wasted drifting in the Caribbean. And yet, after all that delay, the tanker eventually pushed through. Around November 23rd, after weeks of maneuvering and loitering, Seahorse finally crossed into Venezuelan waters. Tracking data shows it heading toward an oil terminal on the country's northeastern coast, with maritime reports pointing to ports such as Puerto Jose or Puerto La Cruz. So does that mean the U.S. Navy failed? The answer depends on how you define the mission. If the objective was to physically stop every Russian fuel shipment from ever reaching Venezuela, then the tanker's arrival would count as a tactical setback. But navies don't operate on simple win-loss tallies. Their actions are shaped by political direction, legal boundaries, and long-term strategic aims. Here, those aims included making sanctions evasion more difficult, increasing the cost of every sanctioned voyage, collecting intelligence on shadow fleet behavior, and signaling to allies and adversaries alike that Washington is prepared to put real naval power at sea to enforce its policies without crossing into open conflict. By those measures, Seahorse became a highly instructive case. Above all, it showed how a shadow fleet vessel reacts when pressure is applied. The AIS tracks tell a clear story, one that insurers, port authorities, and foreign regulators can all interpret. Repeated aborted approaches, close proximity to a U.S. warship, followed by a delayed but successful arrival, all feed directly into risk assessments. That, in turn, can mean higher insurance premiums or a refusal to provide coverage at all, striking at the economic engine that keeps these tankers operating. Second, it proved a remarkably effective model. A single destroyer, supported by the broader U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean, used positioning, persistent tracking, and sheer visibility to influence a commercial decision. It's a playbook other navies and coast guards can study and adapt. It avoids escalation, stays firmly within international law, and still creates meaningful friction for ships trying to skirt sanctions. Third, the message went far beyond Moscow and Caracas. China, Iran, and anyone else watching events in the Caribbean saw that even one Arleigh Burke class destroyer can disrupt a voyage for weeks without launching a single weapon. For the sailors aboard the Stockdale, the mission doesn't feel dramatic. From the outside, it appears calm and uneventful. Inside the ship, on the bridge, and in the Combat Information Center, or CIC, the work is defined by patience, accuracy, and constant cross-checking. Watch teams cycle through their stations, maintaining tracks on surface contacts scattered across tens of miles of ocean. Every contact on the screen carries a speed, a course, a last fix, and a projected position. Every few minutes, those figures shift just enough to demand another calculation. Radar operators fine-tune the surface, picture-while intelligence. Specialists feed in updates from classified sources that never appear on public ship tracking websites. Navigation teams repeatedly run closest point of approach calculations, factoring in wind, currents, and the movements of other vessels in the area. Helicopter crews remain on standby if closer inspection is needed. Their role planned hours before a rotor ever spins. Inside the CIC, it doesn't feel extraordinary, just an ongoing series of familiar problem-solving cycles. A contact drifts 10 degrees to port, and the maneuvering board is updated immediately. Another vessel adds 2 knots of speed, and the next watch calculates how long it will take before its projected track intersects with Stockdale's. At set intervals, the team cross-checks every move against call regs, the international rules designed to prevent collisions at sea, ensuring that every decision can be justified if it's ever scrutinized later. Legal advisors, and intelligence specialists are woven into this process as seamlessly as the navigation team. They provide guidance on what qualifies as a safe, lawful maneuver, what could be interpreted as interference, and where the destroyer has unrestricted freedom to operate. That advice directly influences every course change the officers of the deck approve. Because in missions like this, the paper trail matters almost as much as where the ship actually goes. Nothing is too minor to record. A 15-degree alteration in heading log down to the precise minute and second. A deliberate speed reduction to preserve safe separation. A check-in with the helicopter detachment confirming they're ready if needed. In the moment, these actions can feel routine. But if anything ever goes wrong, an unexpected move by the tanker, a misunderstood call, or a mechanical failure, every knot of speed and every degree of turn will be dissected afterward. The crew understands that reality, and it's reflected in the careful, exacting way they do their jobs. Bridge-to-bridge communications stay calm and formal, even when the intent behind them is unmistakable. The message is simple. We see you. We understand who's behind this ship. We know where the cargo is headed, and we'll still be here tomorrow. At the same time, Seahorse isn't some unmanned phantom. Its crew still has watches to stand, engines to maintain, and cargo to manage, all while knowing a highly capable U.S. destroyer is tracking them from just beyond the horizon. But from the Navy's perspective, this wasn't a one-off incident. It was a glimpse of what modern competition looks like. Rivalry between major powers now plays out in these gray zones. Shadow shipping networks, sanctions evasion, indirect support, and plausible deniability. There aren't always clean victories or obvious defeats. Instead, there are patterns, trial runs, and carefully delivered signals. Seahorse was one of those signals, not announced in statements or briefings, but written into AIS tracks. One destroyer, maneuvering in international waters. No force, just presence. No escalation, just pressure. And a reminder that sometimes the most effective thing a warship can do is simply occupy the space the other side wishes it didn't. If you had been in command on the Stockdale, how far would you have pushed it? Would you keep shadowing after a third course reversal? Or ease off once the intelligence picture was complete? Let us know how you'd balance law, deterrence, and escalation, and we'll see you in the comments.